Welcome to Data Magic, the official podcast of Project Unicorn. We are a national initiative dedicated to radically improving data interoperability, the safe, secure, and seamless flow of education data to support student learning. Each episode, we sit down with the leaders, innovators, and builders who are designing the infrastructure for real-time, secure, student-centered data. Whether you are a district or state leader, an edtech developer, or simply curious about the future of education, we're here to help you understand why interoperability matters and how we can all help make it a reality. In this episode, we explore K-12 cybersecurity through the lens of policy and data governance. Sarah Cluck with SIIA joins us as we look at the biggest threats facing schools today, how districts can write stronger vendor agreements to handle data breaches, and what guardrails are needed as AI enters the classroom. Sarah, thanks so much for joining us today. From SIIA's vantage point across the edtech industry, what cybersecurity threats are you seeing most frequently that target K-12 districts right now? And how have they maybe shifted in the last couple of years? And how has that impacted policy?
I think I wouldn't necessarily call it the biggest threat, but I think one of the biggest things that we in the industry and in the school community need to understand is everyone has a role in cybersecurity protections. Whether it is vendors allowing the ability to have multi-factor authorization or school administrators requiring multi-factor authorization or educators using multi-factor authorization. That's just one example, but everyone sort of getting on the same page and understanding what is needed there. So I think from the policy perspective, we've seen states and districts introduce new requirements for cybersecurity for vendors and have more discussions on what is required when it comes to vendor contracts. But I think that understanding rules and understanding what needs to happen when there is a breach, how to mitigate breaches. I think that's understanding everyone's direct role in protecting the cybersecurity of data that is collected in a school setting.
Well, speaking of the school setting, I think that districts kind of often lag behind the private industry when it comes to that cybersecurity and the maturity of it. What are some barriers that you see that are kind of in the way, that are causing that obstacle and being the gap there? And is there a funding mechanism that districts might be able to leverage to kind of close that gap?
Well, I think districts are competing for employees with private industry, and private industry is often able to pay employees on a different scale than public entities. So there is a competition for highly qualified employees that can understand and work in the cybersecurity space, but also in industry, they are able to build tools and resources for their districts and schools to help beef up that cybersecurity. So I think when we're thinking about funding mechanisms, that districts may be able to leverage to close the gap. I think when you're looking at things like professional development funding or Title 4A funding, making sure that you are using the resources and all of the tools in your toolbox to identify how to bring employees up to speed, whether they're existing employees or new employees up to speed on cybersecurity practices, leverage your relationships with your vendors to ensure that products are set up in a way that is privacy protective and deploying the cybersecurity mechanisms in the right place. And I think that can be handled both through contracts, but also through existing relationships.
You reference the privacy factor there, and I think that's a
Mhm.
big element when it comes to cybersecurity. But in the district and the school setting, federal frameworks like FERPA are so prevalent. Do you think that is working well in the
Mhm.
district industry as opposed to maybe just general privacy that the private sector maybe has.
Sure. Well, I think one of the key advantages that FERPA has as a regulatory regime is that at its heart, it's a data minimization statute saying that vendors should only be collecting the information that they need, and that information typically needs to be under the direct control of a school district. So in vendor and school agreements, I think districts and states should make sure that they are outlining expectations on how the data that is being collected um, is protected. And that is a requirement of FERPA anyways. So
Mhm.
making sure that they're aligning to FERPA and COPPA and SIPA and all of the other data protection regimes that we have in our country. There's a number of state level data privacy regimes as well. So making sure that the data is adequately protected through those contracts that are signed or by making sure that data is only collected for the time it is needed and the amount of data that is collected is only that which is needed.
The time parameters that are an interesting caveat that a lot of the states
Yeah.
have, and it can vary state by state. Do you
hmm
think that some of those frameworks, like NIST for education and different state by state requirements for some of these
hmm
policies, do you think that ed tech vendors have a difficult time because it's kind of like patchwork all over the place?
I mean, I think that's the nature of working in education is that the United States has a local control regime in that localities get to decide what works best for their community. So vendors, well, it would be much easier to deal with one overall rule and one overall framework. I think understanding the state and district policies is something that vendors adapt to. I think it's not just because there's a patchwork, using your word, a patchwork of state requirements when it comes to cybersecurity. Curriculum is different in every
Mhm.
state, and uh, curriculum and the tools that are needed are different in every state and district. So adapting to what their customers need is something that vendors are accustomed to. It's not ideal by any means,
Right.
but it is part of working in the education system in the US.
That is very true. It is something that across the spectrum of education, the piecemeal and the difference of state by state. Do
Mhm.
you think there's something that maybe districts can do to design their data policies and their vendor agreements with like clearer expectations over things like breach notification, incident response, security transparency that maybe makes it easier for these ed tech vendors? And then with those existing contracts, even though you don't necessarily deal with the contracts specifically, but are they maybe falling short in a certain way by not having this clear outline at the beginning?
Mhm. Well, I think there's a lot. This is a big question because I think that many, most, if not all, states have data breach laws on the books for consumer notification. It does not just apply in the education setting. We all are used to probably receiving the notice in the mail saying we have monitoring services because there was a data breach in XYZ and here's the data that was released. That's because of these state laws. Um, I think when districts are designing their data policies, they not only need to think about what the vendor does for the school, but how that impacts their reporting on required things required by the state or feds. So, for example, if if you are looking at a data breach notification and or there's a data breach and the requirement in the contract says you immediately need to delete all data. I have not seen this example, but I'm just giving sort of a far out there example.
Okay.
If the contract says immediately delete all data, um, from your servers, that does not really align to how education works because you need grades or you need to make sure that you have kids' information in case you need to call their parents. Um, I think when you're designing these policies, you need to think about how the product is used, and work with your vendor to understand obligations when there is a breach. Like I said before, they have their own obligations according to some state laws, but I think that if writing policies that say the vendor needs to notify all parents, but the vendor doesn't have any parent information, figuring out what that means,
Right.
because how is the vendor going to be able to notify the parents if they don't have any information on who the parents are? If,
Right.
say, they're only collecting not even if it's not even they're collecting very minimal data and don't even have student names. Like, what does that mean? I think making sure your policies are reflective of what data is collected, um, and having reasonable timelines to make sure that that a data breach is locked down and that they are able to identify and be transparent about the process. I think the Future of Privacy Forum has done over the years some really good work in this area on what it means to talk about data breaches and how to work in this space. And I think they and other organizations that work in education cybersecurity have really done a lot of work on things like incident response and how to communicate to the community what happened.
I think that communication element is key because there's a sense of concern and worry that centers around data breaches, like for
Mhm.
anyone, and how you communicate it is so imperative to keep that trust factor with the
Mhm.
districts. And if you are announcing as a district a new vendor agreement with an ed tech company, I think that is probably one of the first things that comes up as a parent, or
Yeah.
even a teacher or an educator within the school building.
Yeah, and I think also there may be in a scenario where like a teacher has a password, or I'm not even going to use the word teacher here. I'm going to say a volunteer in this classroom has a password on a sticky note on their desk, and then a kid gets into it and downloads all of the information and shares it with the class. Who is that? Does the vendor know that happened? Probably not, because they don't have a line of sight into the classroom. But the teacher can see it happened, or the school administrator can see it happened, or whatever is happening in the classroom is a good indication of what happened. When we're talking about roles, responsibility, transparency, understanding, like I said at the top, sort of the roles in cybersecurity and understanding that everyone has a role to play, putting those passwords on sticky notes on the desk maybe isn't the best um, is not necessarily a best practice, but also understanding like what role the school has in that setting, what role the vendor has. Like I said, the vendor may not have any idea that it happened, but the school definitely does if there's chaos in the classroom and figuring out how they need to notify. That's an important discussion to have.
Definitely. I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about how this cybersecurity concept reflects in the world of AI. What sort of policy artifacts do districts need in order to establish like clear guardrails around AI, particularly with security of data that flows through some of these third-party AI systems?
Yeah. Well, I think just because it's a new technology doesn't mean the old laws don't apply. So I think we are seeing that FERPA applies in this setting. Civil rights laws apply in this setting. So understanding at the district level and from the company level how you're collecting data, how you're protecting that data, how you're sharing that data, how it's used, are all conversations that we've had. Um, in the software space, and it's the same when you're using AI. You need to have those conversations to make sure you're answering those questions. So, a privacy policy is just as important today as it was before. Contracts to understand obligations are important as well. And understanding especially when it comes to FERPA, if there is a contract designating a vendor, um, saying that the vendor is able to access and collect information because it's doing a job that would otherwise be done by an employee of the school district, um, understanding that that data is still under the direct control of the school. And the school is the one that can make decisions on what happens to the data and make sure that it's protected. And the school has an obligation to make sure that data is protected, just the same as they always have.
I think that's a good point to that this has kind of existed for a while. There's been a lot of learning programs that these districts have used that have had some element of AI kind of already in them with like a chat response situation. I think the prevalence of how educators and students are using AI now just is bringing that security issue more to the forefront for a lot of folks that they may not have otherwise realized, just that it's kind of already always been there. That's a good point. Okay, last question, and it's kind of a big one too, and this has to do with like your IT staff budgets within these districts. How can these districts that maybe have a limited staff, limited budget, take the highest leverage step to really making a meaningful improvement and impact on their cybersecurity posture without the major investment that some larger districts may have?
Yeah, I think understanding what your district would do in the event of a breach, understanding who your getting a clear picture of where all of the data is going in your district, whether it's to vendors or to school bus companies, or just understanding sort of where that information is going and how it's protected. And also understanding your relationships and point of contacts at all of your vendors. So you can, if you get a notice from the vendor that there was a data breach, you're able to have a clear contact with somebody and get questions answered fast in case you have questions coming from the parents. Because being able to ask those, being able to get those questions answered is really helpful when it comes to community trust.
Leveraging those relationships. I feel like that's been a common thread kind of
Yeah,
throughout this conversation. Okay, I lied. I do have one more question.
sure.
If you could get every state to adopt one common sense cybersecurity policy for all schools starting tomorrow, what would it be and why?
I mean, the same exact law that is reasonable and forward thinking and technology neutral to make it easier for vendors to find common themes and build out robust cybersecurity practices.
I love it. It's easy for the vendors and it's easy for the district to then implement. So it kind of works hand in hand.
Yeah.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for taking time with us today and being part of the Data Magic podcast with Project Unicorn.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Data Magic. If you are ready to help break down data silos and build a safer, more connected digital ecosystem for your students, we invite you to join the movement. Head over to projectunicorn.org to access our tools, download our latest briefs, and sign the Project Unicorn Pledge. Don't forget to subscribe to Data Magic on your favorite podcast platform and share this episode with a colleague who is ready to make classroom data work for learners. Until next time, keep safe, keep connecting, and let's keep creating data magic.